Plate armor is a historical type of personal body armor made from inner steel plates, culminating in the iconic suit of armor entirely encasing the wearer. While there are early predecessors such as the Roman-era lorica segmentata, full plate armor developed in Europe during the late Middle Ages, especially in the context of the 100 Years' War, from the coat of plates worn over male suits during the 13th century. In Europe, plate armor reached its peak in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. The full suit of armor is thus a feature of the very end of the Middle Ages and of the Renaissance period. Its popular association with the medieval knight is due to the specialized jousting armor which developed in the 16th century. Full suits of Gothic plate armor were worn on the battlefields of the Burgundian and Italian wars. The most heavily armored troops of the period were heavy cavalry such as the gendarmes and early cuirassiers, but the infantry troops of the Swiss mercenaries and the lanzknechts also took to wearing lighter suits of 3/4 munition armor, leaving the lower legs unprotected. The use of plate armor declined in the 17th century, but it remained common both among the nobility and for the cuirassiers throughout the European wars of religion. After 1650, plate armor was mostly reduced to the simple breastplate worn by cuirassiers. This was due to the development of the flintlock musket, which could penetrate armor at a considerable distance. For infantry, the breastplate gained renewed importance with the development of shrapnel in the late Napoleonic Wars. The use of steel plates sewn into flak jackets dates to World War II, replaced by more modern materials such as fiber-reinforced plastic since the 1950s. Early history. Partial plate armor, which protected the chest and the lower limbs, was used by the ancient Greeks and Romans, but it fell into disuse after the collapse of the Roman Empire because of the cost and work involved in producing a piece of metal plate or cuirass. Parthian and Sasanian heavy cavalry units known as clibanarii used cuirasses and small, overlapping plates in the manner of the manica for the protection of arms and legs. Single plates of metal armor were again used from the late 13th century on to protect joints and shins, and these were worn over a mail hauberk. Gradually the number of plate components of medieval armor increased, protecting further areas of the body, and embodying those of a cavalryman's horse. Armorers developed skills in articulating the limbs or individual plates for parts of the body that needed to be flexible, and in fitting armor to the individual wearer like a tailor. The cost of a full suit of high-quality fitted armor, as opposed to the cheaper munition armor, was enormous, and inevitably restricted to the wealthy who were seriously committed to either soldiering or jousting. The rest of an army wore inconsistent mixtures of pieces, with still playing an important part. Late Middle Ages. By about 1420, complete suits of plate armor had been developed. A full suit of plate armor would have consisted of a helmet, a gorget, pauldrons, bassages, rondels, counters, vambraces, gauntlets, a cuirass with a fold, tassets and a collet, a mail skirt, cuisses, polines, greaves, and sabatons. The very fullest sets, known as garniches, more often made for jousting than war, included pieces of exchange, alternate piece suiting different purposes, so that the suit could be configured for a range of different uses. For example, fighting on foot or on horse. A complete suit of plate armor made from well-tempered steel would weigh around 15 to 25 kilograms. The wearer remained highly agile and could jump, run and otherwise move freely as the weight of the armor was spread evenly throughout the body. The armor was articulated and covered a man's entire body completely from neck to toe. In the 15th and 16th centuries, large bodies of men-at-arms numbering thousands or even even more than 10,000 men were fighting on foot wearing full plate next to archers and crossbowmen. This was commonly seen in the Western European armies, especially of France and England during the 100 Years' War, the Wars of the Roses of the Italian Wars. European leaders in armoring techniques were northern Italians, especially from Milan, and southern Germans, who had somewhat different styles, but styles were diffused around Europe, often by the movement of armourers. The Renaissance Greenwich armour was made by a royal workshop near London that had imported Italian, Flemish and German craftsmen, though it soon developed its own unique style. Ottoman Turkey also made wide use of plate armour but incorporated larger amounts of mail into their armour, which was widely used by shock troops such as the Janissary Corps. Effect on weapon development: plate armour was virtually invulnerable to sword slashes. It also protected the wearer well against spear or pike thrusts and provided decent defense against blunt trauma. The evolution of plate armor also triggered developments in the design of offensive weapons. While this armor was effective against cuts or blows, the weak points could be exploited by long tapered swords or other weapons designed for the purpose, such as poleaxes and halberds. The effect of arrows and bolts is still a point of contention in regards to plate armor. The evolution of the 14th century plate armor also triggered the development of various polearms. They were designed to deliver a strong impact and concentrate energy on a small area and cause damage through the plate. Maces, warhammers and the hammerheads of poleaxes were used to inflict blunt trauma through armor. Fluted plate was not only decorative, but also reinforced the plate against bending under slashing a blunt impact. This offsets against the tendency for flutes to catch piercing blows. In armored techniques taught in the German school of swordsmanship, the attacker concentrates on these weak spots, resulting in a fighting style very different from unarmored sword fighting. Because of this weakness, most warriors wore a mail shirt beneath the plate armor. Later, full mail shirts were replaced with mail patches, called gussets, sewn onto a gambeson or arming jacket. Further protection for plate armor was the use of small round plates called bissages that covered the armpit area and couters and purlines with wings to protect the inside of the joint. Renaissance Germans called Maximilian armor of the early 16th century as a style using heavy fluting and some decorative etching, as opposed to the plain of finish on 15th century white armor. The shapes include influence from Italian styles. This era also saw the use of closed helms, as opposed to the 15th century style salets and barbutes. During the early 16th century, the helmet and neckguard design was reformed to produce the so-called Nuremberg armor, many of them masterpieces of workmanship and design. As firearms became better and more common on the battlefield, the utility of full armor gradually declined, and full suits became restricted to those made for jousting, which continued to develop. The decoration of fine armor greatly increased in the period, using a whole range of techniques, and further greatly increasing the cost. Elaborately decorated plate armor for royalty and the very wealthy was being produced. Highly decorated armor is often called parade armor, a somewhat misleading term, as such armor might well be worn on active military service. Steel plate armor for Henry II of France, made in 1555, is covered with meticulous embossing, which has been subjected to bluing, silvering and gilding. Such work required armorers to either collaborate with artists or have artistic skill of their own. Another alternative was to take designs from ornament prints and other prints, as was often done. Daniel Hopfer was an etcher of armor by training, who developed etching as a form of printmaking. Other artists such as Hans Holbein the Younger produced designs for armor. The Milanese armorer Filippo Negroli, from a leading dynasty of armorers, was the most famous modeler of figurative relief decoration on armor. A partial exception to the declining protection offered by armor came in the Age of Discovery, as Europeans encountered the natives of parts of the world still without firearms. The Spanish conquistadors found armor extremely practical and intimidating to the Amerindians, and in the early North American colonial period some pieces of armor, especially breastplates and helmets, continued to be worn. Infantry reduced plate armor, typically consisting of a breastplate, a burgonet, morion, a cuirass, and gauntlets, however, also became popular among 16th-century mercenaries, and there are many references to so-called munition armor being ordered for infantrymen at a fraction of the cost of full plate armor. This mass-produced armor was often heavier and made of lower quality metal than fine armor for commanders. Jousting specialized jousting armor produced in the late 15th to 16th century was heavier and could weigh as much as 50 kilograms. As it was not intended for free combat, it did not need to permit free movement, the only limiting factor being the maximum weight that could be carried by a war horse of the period. The medieval joust has its origins in the military tactics of heavy cavalry during the High Middle Ages. These became obsolete during the 14th century, and since the 15th century, jousting had become a sport without direct relevance to warfare. During the 1490s, Emperor Maximilian I invested a lot of effort into perfecting the sport, for which he received his nickname of the Last Knight. Rennen and Stechen were two sportive forms of the joust developed during the 15th century and practiced throughout the 16th century. The armors used for these two respective styles of the joust was known as Rennzug and Stechzug, respectively. The Stechzug in particular developed into extremely heavy armor which completely inhibited the movement of the rider, in its latest forms resembling an armor-shaped cabin integrated into the horse armor more than a functional suit of armor. Such forms of sportive equipment during the final phase of the joust in 16th century Germany gave rise to modern misconceptions about the heaviness or clumsiness of medieval armor, as notably popularized by Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. The extremely heavy helmets of the Stechzug are explained by the fact that the aim was to detach the crest of the opponent's helmet, resulting in frequent full impact of the lance to the helmet. By contrast, the Rennen was a type of joust with lighter contact. Here, the aim was to hit the opponent's shield. The specialized Rennzug was developed on the request of Maximilian, who desired a return to a more agile form of joust compared to the heavily armored, full-contact Stechen. In the Rennzug, the shield was attached to the armor with a mechanism of springs and would detach itself upon contact. Early modern period. Plate armor was widely used by most armies until the end of the 17th century for both foot and mounted troops such as the cuirassiers, dragoons, demi-lancers and Polish hussars. The infantry armor of the 16th century developed into the Savoyard type of three-quarters armor by 1600. Full-plate armor was expensive to produce and remained therefore restricted to the upper strata of society. Lavishly decorated suits of armor remained the fashion with 18th-century nobles and generals long after they had ceased to be militarily useful on the battlefield due to the advent of inexpensive muskets. The development of powerful rifled firearms made all but the finest and heaviest armor obsolete. The increasing power and availability of firearms and the nature of large, state-supported infantry led to more portions of plate armor being cast off in favor of cheaper, more mobile troops. Leg protection was the first part to go, replaced by tall leather boots. By the beginning of the 18th century, only field marshals, commanders and royalty remained in full armor on the battlefield, more as a sign of rank than for practical considerations. It remained fashionable for monarchs to be portrayed in armor during the first half of the 18th century, but even this tradition became obsolete. Thus, a portrait of Frederick the Great in 1739 still shows him in armor, while a later painting showing him as a commander in the 7 Years' War depicts him without armor. Body armor remained in use with cuirassiers throughout the 19th century and into the early phase of World War I. The cuirass represents the final stage of the tradition of plate armor descended from the late medieval period. Meanwhile, makeshift steel armor against shrapnel and early forms of ballistic vests began to be developed from the mid-19th century. Japan. In Kofun period Japan, during the 4th and 5th centuries, very advanced iron plate cuirasses called tanko and helmets were made. Plate armor was used in Japan during the Nara period. Both plate and lamella armors have been found in burial mounds, and haniwa have been found depicting warriors wearing full armor. In Japan, the warfare of the Sengoku period required large quantities of armor to be produced for the ever-growing armies of foot soldiers. Simple munition-quality chest armors and helmets were mass-produced. In 1543, the Portuguese brought matchlock firearms to Japan. The Japanese started to manufacture the Portuguese-acquired matchlocks, and the use of these firearms in warfare caused the gradual decline in the use of the centuries-old lamella armor that the samurai were known for. The Japanese armor makers started to use solid iron plates in their armor designs, which were based on European armors, and eventually plate armor became the standard for samurai warriors. The new-style Japanese plate armors were called Toseigaseku in order to differentiate from the old-style lamella armors. Japanese armor makers designed bulletproof plate armors called Tameshigaseku, which allowed soldiers to continue wearing armor despite the heavy use of firearms in the late 1500s. In the 1600s, warfare in Japan came to an end, but the samurai continued to use plate armor until the end of the samurai era in the 1860s, with the known last use of samurai armor occurring in 1877 during the Satsuma Rebellion. Modern body armor. The cavalry armor of Napoleon and the French, German, and British empires were actively used through the 19th century right up to the first year of World War I, when French cuirassiers went to meet the enemy in armor outside of Paris. Body armor made a brief reappearance in the American Civil War with mixed success. During the war, both sides experimented with shrapnel armor, and some soldiers used their own but dedicated ballistic armor, such as the American Brewster-body shield, although not widely produced. In 1916, General Adrien of the French Army provided an abdominal shield which was light in weight and easy to wear. A number of British officers recognized that many casualties could be avoided if effective armor were available. The first usage of the term flak jacket refers to the armor originally developed by the Wilkinson Sword Company during World War II to help protect Royal Air Force air personnel from the flying debris and shrapnel. The Red Army also made use of ballistic steel body armor, typically chest plates, for combat engineers and assault infantry. After World War II, steel plates were soon replaced by vests made from synthetic fiber, in the 1950s made of either boron carbide, silicon carbide, or aluminum oxide. They were issued to the crew of low-flying aircraft, such as the UH-1 and UC-123, during the Vietnam War. The synthetic fiber Kevlar was introduced in 1971, and most ballistic vests since the 1970s are based on Kevlar, optionally with the addition of trauma plates to reduce the risk of blunt trauma injury. Such plates may be made of ceramic, metal, or synthetic materials.